Originally, this video was going to be titled A Tale of Two Magical Girls Shows. My thought was that since there were two shows that concerned magical girls airing in the fall 2024 season, I would talk about the both of them together. A compare and contrast sort of thing to take a look at two shows that were just 12 episodes long, since most of the magical girl stuff I've looked at on this channel has been lengthier fare. Let you know if there was anything to these two shows that could be watched over the course of a weekend, you know? But then I realized if I broadened things by just a few more shows, I could talk about most of the magical girl anime that aired this year. A sort of year in review for how the genre was handled. It felt like it was worth it, since there were a decent amount of them this year, instead of there just being the yearly Precure season and then maybe one or two more. Enough so that I actually had to disqualify some things from being talked about here. So let's touch on those real quick before we actually get to the year in review. There was a Balala the Fairies season that came out, but I won't be digging into this. It's not only specifically a sequel season, but comes in the wake of the rest of the franchise, which I have no experience with. As far as I'm aware, unfortunately, that's a series that's a little hit or miss for fan translation efforts as well, making it hard to get a full scope of the thing. Even if it wasn't a sequel season, I never feel comfortable commenting on a series unless it has a completed translation and I can get the full context for everything. Enjo Bokumatsu Maho Shoujo Aiko came out in the winter season last year, and honestly, I don't think it was on anybody's radar at all. The only place I could find it were some uploads on YouTube, and I've got no idea what it's about. It's just 4-minute episodes, and none of them have any form of translation, so I've got no idea what its deal is. Without a translation, it wasn't something I felt comfortable commenting on in any depth, but it doesn't seem to be anything all that robust to begin with, so I doubt we're missing all that much. I am also choosing to exclude the Sailor Moon Cosmos movies from this discussion. I wanted to focus more in on series rather than movies, and because these are acting as the capstone to a long-running anime remake project adapting a seminal magical girl manga, while definitely a big part of the magical girl space this year, they weren't really of this year, if that makes sense. They're certainly wonderful, but at the end of the day, they are a readaptation, and the idea here was to focus on what's new in the space right now. And finally, I am excluding Wonderful Precure from this discussion. At time of writing, this current season of Precure has not come to an end quite yet, so it would be hard to judge its merits without having a full picture. Also, I just haven't watched it. I'm working my way through Precure as a franchise in order since I want to trace the evolution of the series. As a result, I'm not currently up to date and I'm not skipping seasons in order to be so. I will someday catch up, but that day has not yet come. Trust me that Wonderful Precure will get its own video when we reach that point, and I am ready to talk about it, just like all Precure seasons that I've covered so far. So that leaves us with 5 shows to talk about. The winter 2024 season gave us Gushing Over Magical Girls, There Were No Magical Girls in Spring, summer gave us The Magical Girl and the Evil Lieutenant Used to Be Archenemies, and fall gave us Magilumiere Magical Girls Inc. and Acro Trip. Beyond that, I am also adding in the stories of girls who couldn't be magicians, since while it's not a magical girl in the current common arrangement, it is still a show about girls who are magical. We're going to move through the year chronologically and talk about the shows in this order that they released in. My goal is to determine what each of these contributed to the landscape of the genre in the past year, if they did at all, so let's get into it. A warning now before we actually enter its section. If you are not aware of the contents of Gushing Over Magical Girls, well, it's a series that had a censored and uncensored version, if that gives you any idea. It's a series with extremely overt sexual themes and scenes, including nudity and BDSM content with characters who are minors. If that is not something you are interested in seeing or discussing, you can skip the next 2 sections, one a lengthy disclaimer and the other one the actual discussion of the show, and go to the timestamp listed here on screen to do so. I am not going to show anything graphic on screen during these upcoming sections. But if this is a subject matter that you wish to avoid entirely, I completely understand and 100% do not judge you for skipping this. I'll see those of you who do skip it over on the other side. I really did mean that warning, but if you're here, I guess. And even after that warning before, I feel a need to give a hefty disclaimer and set the tone for how we're going to be talking about this show because it is something that has been very divisive online. If you've been following me for a while, you might be a little confused as to how I can talk about this series if I dropped it. Months ago on my community tab, I posted a link to a Patreon upload of a TikTok that I had posted talking about why I dropped Gushing over Magical Girls after just 2 episodes. I could have dropped it after 1, but I chose to give it a fair shot of a second episode just to confirm my problems with it. I even read a few chapters of the manga to gauge the level of adaptation. So if you're gearing up to type something in the comments, just hear me out and let me give some disclaimers before you hit post, okay? Frankly, if the adult elements of this series are something that completely drives you away from it, I completely and totally understand. They were something that kept me from watching it until I needed to for the sake of this video. This isn't something that's just going for light fan service, but is engaging with some pretty overt sexuality and pushing it in your face pretty regularly. Costumes tearing doesn't always leave just enough covering things for plausible deniability. It will just let those things hang out. Honestly, it seems the only thing the show isn't willing to completely show off is genitalia, but even with that, the show is perfectly willing to show an outline of what is hidden away under the panties, as long as the panties stay on. There's also the issue that basically all of the sexual contact between the villains and the magical girls that occurs is either non-consensual or dubiously consensual. For some people, even if they were fine with the sexual elements, the lack of consent, even between characters who are entirely fictional and as a result don't have the capacity to give or withhold consent since they're not real, is going to be a huge deal breaker. They're just not going to want to see that. And then, even if you get past that, there's also the issue that the characters involved in the magical back and forth that we see on an episode by episode basis are mostly underage with just a few exceptions. That is yet another hurdle that people would have to be able to get past to watch this show. Outside of one instance where we are seeing a character through another character's warped perspective, none of the characters that are sexualized have the more childlike, lolly body type. All of them have developed figures to some extent. Their age could be changed to be of age without changing the story or art, and it seems to me that the ages were chosen, at least partially, for being a common magical girl age as a piece of genre awareness. That said, that makes little to no material difference in the end product. They still do have arbitrarily assigned number ages in canon that do make them underage. The one member of the main cast who is a younger child and does have a childlike body type is not sexualized in the same manner as the rest of the cast, and it's even made clear that her gaze is deliberately diverted from perverse scenes by other characters for this reason. However, there are 1 or 2 occasions where she engages in actions which, in universe for her, seem to be a form of genuine play, but to the audience do come across as fetish material. This character rarely speaks, so it is unclear just how much she does or doesn't understand what is happening. This, too, is going to be a deal breaker for people, and I also completely understand that. You do not have to justify not liking this show to me. I am well aware of the problems that it has. It is a show that deserves to come with a mountain of warnings before you even lay eyes on it. I also completely understand giving anyone who says they are a fan of this a little bit of a side eye. I don't believe that the media we consume or create should be looked upon as the only indicator of our morality. But even if there is good I can find in this series when I am looking at it from a thematic and character level, I am aware that there is a subset of people who watch this just because they found it hot. I don't believe that is a complete indicator of their morality either, but I am not interested in discussing or engaging with them. I just want us to be on the same page here, and I don't want things to get nasty in the comments. I want to discuss what small bits of this show I find interesting, but in order to be able to do that and keep this discussion at a reasonable length, I need to be able to go 3 sentences without having to give a disclaimer. So all this is to say, I understand the problems. I recognize them, and I will not try and tell you that you should just completely ignore them because they're not a big deal. They are, and it is very much going to depend on the person if they're able to look past them or not. However, for the sake of being able to discuss this series at all, for the remainder of the time I talk about it in this video, I am going to set all of that aside and not comment much on it, if at all. Once again, you are free to skip this segment of the video if you cannot accept that. You are free to not engage with this discussion, and you have control over what you watch. I am talking about this for the sake of giving a full picture of the shows that released this year, and this is one of them, whether you like it or not. I watched it fully, not for any sexual gratification, but intellectual curiosity. I will be paying strict attention to the comments section on this video, and any comments that talk about gushing or this segment of the video will be heavily moderated, up to and including deletion. I am expecting that all of us are going to be mature about this and not engage on the basis of just knee-jerk reactions or attack or insult each other. We are going to keep this civil, and if you don't think you can do that or find yourself unable to do that, I'm going to need you to skip this segment or this video entirely for both our sakes. And now that we're all on the same page, we can finally talk about this show. Here's the thing about me. If there is a piece of media about a subject that I'm interested in, I can sometimes be willing to put up with a lot of bad to engage with the parts of it that I do like. This show was a bit of a test for how much I was willing to put up with. The answer ended up being not as much as this show is doing, so I passed it over. However, for the sake of fairness and for this video, I went back and I watched every episode of the series, and I took notes this time. Even comparing the first episode to the first 2 chapters of the manga revealed some pretty stark differences between the two. For those who are not familiar with the premise of this series, Gushing Over Magical Girls follows Utena, a very average girl who is quite shy but hugely looks up to the trio of magical girls that protect her town. She's a huge fangirl of them. One day she is approached by a little black and gold mascot who offers to help her transform. The only problem is that she transforms into a villainess rather than a magical girl, meant to fight the girls that she admires so much rather than fight alongside them. Through a combination of misunderstanding, mistrust, and blackmail, she does end up fighting 3 of them for the first time. At which point it is revealed that she might actually have a knack for this whole villain thing because, as it turns out, even if she didn't realize it yet, she's a huge sadist and gets pleasure from tormenting the magical girls with her own 2 hands. She doesn't want to be doing this, but it does really seem the moment she's actually put in front of them, there is some part of her that really can't resist the urge, almost as if changing into a villain removes any of the inhibitions she might have otherwise had. The whole show is then mostly about her being that villain that she's thrust into the role of, and the way she grows through that, starting with working on her own, to meeting her fellow villains, to meeting the higher-ups, and then eventually overtaking them when their goals fail to align. At first glance, it's pretty clear that this is trying to parody some elements of magical girl tropes. The pink lead magical girl isn't just energetic, kind, and a bit of a ditz, but she's actually kind of an ineffective leader, and her clever plans are usually just kind of stupid. The yellow magical girl is initially shown only to be able to produce shields, until it is revealed that she is actually capable of being a brawler with massive magical fists that she expressly doesn't use because it might frighten the kids who look up to her. The evil mascot character that gave Utena the capability to transform straight up lies to her face that he's part of an oppressed race of mascots that have been mislabeled as evil. When Utena meets the higher-ups of her evil organization, she ends up turning against them because she doesn't care about doing evil, but instead just wants to be the villain for the magical girls to defeat and overcome, to make them shine and make sure nobody else is going to be able to beat them. She cares so much about that goal that she defeats them and overtakes the organization to become the new leader so they won't destroy the magical girls she loves so much. And the evil mascot orchestrated it all himself because the original leader was useless to him and he wanted to press Utena into a new level of power. I know it might seem strange to hear, but there is some bones to this thing under all the, Personally, I'm of the belief that it is pretty rare for a show to be completely without merit. Even if I might not enjoy elements of a show, there's going to be someone out there who does. Which is why even when I don't like a show, I do find it fun to try and find something in it that I enjoy. Which is why even when this show initially put me off, there were some elements of it that I found interesting enough to give the manga a shot. Personally, I think the manga is the superior execution of what this show is trying to do, but by the nature of this being an adaptation of the manga, part of those things that are good do make it into the show too. At its core, Gushing is a series that is all about self-discovery. A lot of that comes in the form of teenagers Discovering their sexual preferences and kinks, yes, but that is still indeed a form of self-discovery. Our teenage years are when we start figuring out what kind of things we like and don't like. It might not always happen as suddenly and fully sexually as depicted in this series, sure, but puberty is the point where certain things in shows or movies or real life even start giving you weird feelings and interesting thoughts and making you pay attention. Which is why making media for teenagers is so dangerous. Show them something weird when the hormones hit, and you'll have accidentally given someone a highly specific kink. Like I said in that TikTok, though, as a grown woman, I'm in a place where I'm not really looking to watch teenage characters figure that out in real time, though. At least not in the manner this series is going for with the self-discovery. However, that isn't the only way that the series gets into these things, thankfully. The thing that is interesting to me about Gushing is the way that power is derived from self-understanding. It is only when characters come to a more full understanding of themselves as a person that they are able to achieve their real potential. So much so that the name generally given to the power-up form change is La Verita or La Veritas, depending on which translation you look at, which translates to the truth. Sayo is the only one who is able to achieve this in what the anime covers, so we'll go over it with her as a case study to avoid getting into spoiler territory. Sayo is the blue magical girl of the trio and outwardly embodies the archetype of the prim and proper smart girl. Her character design has a sense of refinement to it, and she even works at her family shrine, something meant to indicate a sense of diligence to the audience. Of course, given the way this series likes to toy with archetypes a little, when she's actually doing magical girl stuff, she is one of the ones that is a little less effective, shown to get grabbed by created monsters pretty easily and needing to be set free once the rest of the fight has been mostly wrapped up. When apologizing for this happening, she's also kind of blubbering, a distinct departure from the demeanor that we would have assumed at first glance. She is, however, capable of self-reflection, leading to her being the first one to achieve a powered-up state through coming to an understanding of herself. Early on in the series, she ends up having a one-on-one counter with Utena, in which Utena managed to blindfold her, and then instead of running away like she originally intended, instead sticks around a little, engaging in some sensory play by touching Sayo without her being able to tell where it's going to come from next. This does include outright groping and, like everything else, isn't consensual. However, in the aftermath, Sayo is a little dazed, and the encounter clearly leaves a lasting effect on her because she keeps thinking about this. She's caught in this terrible place where it wasn't a consensual encounter, but there were elements of it that she found pleasurable and she can't understand why. This, combined with further encounters, leave Utena even wondering if she's perhaps been pushing Sayo a little too far, since she's not seeming like herself after a while. Eventually, after a little training and motivation finding, Sayo ends up calling out Utena for another one-on-one fight, intending to overcome her and thus overcome whatever's been going on inside her head. Because of the way this show is, she ends up gagged and put into a very intense scenario. At the end of it, she just kind of gives up and gives in to Utena, giving herself over. She breaks. And Utena is absolutely disgusted by this, despite being the cause. She immediately rejects Sayo and rants at her, because despite everything that she does to these girls, this is not what she wants from them. She does not want them to submit to her, because that is not what her idea of a magical girl should do. In her mind, a magical girl should always resist and overcome, no matter what she is put through. Sayo, failing to live up to Utena's mental conception of what she should be, leaves her disgusted and she leaves, leaving Sayo to put herself together in the aftermath. We don't get to see the whole process of what Sayo goes through after this, since at that point the show launches into Utena's little villain group coup arc, and the magical girls are mostly sequestered off to their own training arc that we don't get to see more than glimpses of. However, by the end of that, Sayo gets to reveal the powered-up state that she has come to through an understanding of herself. Sayo's experiences with Utena have revealed to her that she is actually a masochist, in the same way that Utena ended up finding out she was a sadist through her early villain experiences. Sayo also realizes that despite this, she has a job to do before anything else. She needs to hold on to her responsibilities rather than give in. It is a little bit of a repression, possibly symbolized by the way ribbons wrap around and constrain her when she transforms into this powered-up form. She's also called the Vergless Maiden, Vergless being a layer of very thin ice. Sayo does indeed have ice powers, but the idea of thin ice could also be calling to the idea that there is a very thin line that she has deliberately chosen to plant herself on one side of. This is an arc that ties into the core of the show, but at the same time, it's tainted by the idea that a victim of assault actually enjoys being assaulted, which is pretty damn gross. For every shred of good in this show, there are 50 caveats. On a base level, if I were to set everything aside that I find distasteful about the series, I do like the personalities of the characters. I find them fun, and honestly, when we get scenes of characters just hanging out without any of the sexual stuff going on, I actually kind of have a fun time with the series. I don't think that more than a few of them have any actual real depth, but I do enjoy them. This also, strangely, is a show where I don't think there's a single male character in it. Maybe the evil mascot, but they're kind of gender ambiguous and that's never really confirmed. Part of this is obviously because of the sort of appeal this show is going for, but it does mean that all of the relationships and connections we have between characters are between female characters exclusively. There's even a few canon relationships. Despite them being essentially forced into a relationship via being locked in a room together until they get really, really touchy-feely, Nemo and Matama are depicted as being a couple and having legitimate feelings for each other. Feelings that go a long way back if Nemo's flashback is to be believed. Kiwi basically falls for Utena the moment that Utena kicks her ass for the first time, and while Utena resists going to a hotel with Kiwi like the latter is constantly asking for, she never outright rejects Kiwi's actual feelings and just seems uncomfortable with the physicality that she's asking for or the idea of going to a love hotel. And given Utena's penchant for torturing and toying with magical girls for her own personal pleasure, there is an impression and implication that she does indeed like girls. Or at the very least, that girls in some way play into her expression of sexuality. Though, like always, this is very much couched in the fact that this is a show that is trying to appeal to a certain audience in a carnal way, and we have no way of knowing if the author put this in just because girl kissing girl hot, or out of a legitimate desire to explore these pairings as couples. I am not going to be like some people and try and convince you that this show is some kind of an underrated masterpiece that people clearly don't understand. No, this show is pretty straightforward, and having some decently done themes doesn't mean that it gets free rein to do everything it wants to with the everything else without critique. I will say, though, that there is more going on here than I expected from what I was given in the first episode or two of the series. I just also happen to think that if you have an interest in the lore and magical girl elements the series is playing with as part of the magical girl half of what it has going on, the anime is the inferior way to do so. In trying to compare the anime and manga, it becomes immediately evident that the anime has ramped up everything the manga is doing, throwing in more leering shots than needed and things of that sort. For example, there's a scene in the first episode that shows the magical girls changing for gym class that was not in the manga at all. Kiwi's flashback showing how she agreed to be a magical girl adds in some implication of self-pleasuring that wasn't there before and takes more lewd camera angles than the manga's framing. The show is clearly approached more horny first, let's say. Like, one detail I found interesting about early on in the manga is that the magical girls were not depicted sexually outside of engaging with Utena, rendering her as this force that brings sexuality into things. Meanwhile, the anime has added that changing scene and will do things like have a panty shot as Utena is leaving or after she has left. It is notable to me that the anime has not plussed up the magical girl elements of the series the way that it did for the horny parts. Or when it did plus those up, it added horny to them, almost as if that was the justification to do so. The places where the series digs in and does more than the manga did do often feel like they're where more sexually charged content can be added. For example, let's look at the transformations. In the manga, Utena's transformation is all shown on just one page, getting across the idea of transformation without having to take up much of a chapter. It's economical, as manga often has to be, but it tells us a lot. It gives the idea of a full transformation sequence with just a handful of images, and while Utena isn't exactly clothed, her body isn't drawn in detail either, giving the impression of one of those transformations where the body turns into a sparkle silhouette until the outfit shows up. The most important thing is the panel showing the joy she feels at being able to transform like the magical girl she looks up to. The joke comes in when this crashes up against reality in the next page at what her costume actually looks like, and that she is not, in fact, turned into a magical girl. The transformation in the show is, well, it isn't awful, but it's a very linear adaptation of the transformation in the manga. Mostly, it's made up of close shots of her costume appearing on her body. While there wasn't much movement conveyed in the manga, that was more because of the medium. The anime had the chance to do some interesting choreography in order to plus this up and simply didn't, which leads to something lackluster. The animation highlight is something that is there for the sake of horniness, the stars appearing on Utena's breasts in lieu of a shirt. There is no shot of that in the manga, but the show is able to give it jiggle physics so it gets added without any further choreo added. The joke still works, but it is noticeable what got plussed up for the anime and what didn't. Kiwi's transformation is only a few small panels in the manga, not even a full page. It gets expanded out for the show, but what does this add? A shot of Kiwi grabbing at her groin and a chance to leer at her almost completely exposed ass, telling us first and foremost about this villain form that she's got a thong on and no pants. Which sucks, because to me, the more eye-catching element of her design is the big, ill-fitting coat that she wears. The Magical Girl Trio's transformations are also lacking anything added to them to elevate them over the drawn version, which is disappointing. What is added that the manga didn't have is nipples, if you watch the uncensored version, that is. While if you look really closely, you might be able to see the small outline shape of a nipple in the manga, they're never actually drawn in. Personally, I don't see what adding those adds to the series in the slightest, since depicting them as nude bodies rather than the more unfilled outlines that the manga uses actually takes away from the magical girl aesthetic rather than adding to it. In general, there's just a lot more attention paid to the horny side of things than the magical girl side of things when it comes to that extra special flavor that is meant to take advantage of the new medium. And if you're there for the horny, I guess then more power to you, but it does mean the show ends up downplaying the magical girl side of things. This also does mean that something that lasted only a few panels in the manga ends up being something that lasts for minutes at a time on screen. On one hand, that makes sense as a bit of a translation from page to screen that's going to happen. It often takes longer for something to be said and acted than it takes to read it in our head. Likewise, a panel that takes you only a few seconds to look at will often take up more time when animated because of the dimension that motion brings to the production. So I end up finding that the manga is the superior way to consume this content, because when you're reading the manga, you can control that pacing yourself. If I don't want to read the sexual bits, then I can just let my eyes slide over them or quickly buzz through any dialogue in case it's plot relevant and spend more of my time lingering in the dialogue scenes. When you're watching the show, unless you're willing to fast forward or watch at an increased speed, you're stuck watching those scenes for as long as the show's storyboarders and directors have decided they want you to. Having more control of the pace allows you to better control your reading experience. And overall, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between the two mediums that the story exists in. The anime feels like a show that was approached as being horniness first and magical girl content second. The manga, while having that content, feels a little more invested in really being a magical girl series. As the story goes on, while that sexual content is still a consistent factor, and there will even be one-off chapters that are just exploring a specific fetish, the magical girl world building and characters continue to be a focus as well and expand in different directions. The story does grow legs a little bit, and some of the characters are having arcs. They're not the most masterful things in the world, and some of them still remain flat or simple, but there is a little something there that does make them, at times, a little compelling. So yes, I have read the entire manga for this show. I do still think there are some interesting things in there, even if there is plenty of content that I find questionable or even off-putting. No, I am not going to recommend it to you in the slightest. Partly because I don't feel comfortable fully endorsing something that I have such severe problems with, but also because this is very much a series that you need to decide for yourself if you're willing to explore or not, and it is going to appeal to an exceptionally narrow field of people. If you want the bottom line, I think there are some interesting concepts here once this story gets the ball rolling, even if that might take a moment. But if you're going to engage with this, avail yourself of every possible warning and just read the manga instead of watching the show. For what this contributed to the landscape, I think given that we're going to be talking about generally more palatable series from here on out, this show really sucked up all the energy in the room for anything sexy or edgy in the magical girl space last year. The Magical Girl and the Evil Lieutenant Used to Be Archenemies is a really quick and easy watch. With half-length episodes, it doesn't take very long to get through the whole series, and you could really just watch it in one sitting if you wanted to. That was definitely the right direction to go with it. Since this is an adaptation of a series of 4-panel comics, to put out full-length episodes would have run the risk of episodes feeling more disjointed or repetitive. The half-length is just about the perfect amount of time for these. I will warn you, though, this is a series that will remain forever incomplete at 3 volumes. Sadly, the author, Kokoa Fujiwara, passed away while writing it. The series is mostly a comedy, but there was groundwork laid from some larger world building that won't be followed through on, so I urge you not to get too invested in those elements and just roll with the fun side of things. One of the first things you're likely to notice about this series is that the art is pretty damn beautiful. It's just so, well, the only word that really comes to mind for me is soft. There's something gentle about the way these characters are drawn and portrayed. From what I can tell, that's something that at least partially carried over from the manga, which also has that lovely art along with a lot of sparkles. I wouldn't say that it's coming at things with what we might consider to be the modern magical girl aesthetic sensibilities, but more in the vein of a romance series instead. Whatever it has going on, though, I really like it. For what the plot is, it's literally what it says on the tin. Shun is the lieutenant for a legion of vague bad guys, and one that is seemingly pretty respected and high up in whatever's going on over there. Though that isn't something that the series gives a terrible amount of insight into. The goal doesn't seem to be anything other than general world domination, and that isn't going anywhere anytime fast. Still, he has a job to do, and that job brings him into conflict with the soft-spoken Byakuya, a young magical girl. For him, it's love at first sight, and he has to reckon with the fact that he has a job to do while still wanting to not only spend time with her, but also keep her from coming to harm from any of his coworkers. This could be the setup for some drama, but the vibe is definitely more comedy here, leading into things like cute little lunch dates between the two of them where they'll just sit in the park and share a snack rather than something of a tense game of cat and mouse to keep these things from being discovered by his organization. There are also just some really solid gags here in making a mockery of some common magical girl tropes that fans of the genre might get a kick out of. Honestly, these are jokes that if this was a full-length series might have gotten old, but the short nature and taking breaks between episodes does keep them from crossing over that line for me. Easily the most fun one comes in the form of Walking Joke Hibana. She's the secondary magical girl introduced a few episodes in, and her whole deal is she is not a very ideal magical girl. At times, she will be depicted as very cute, but most of the time you're going to see her in a more comedic visual. She has a staff, but she'll snap it in half and attack with studded knuckles instead. She's violent, she's bitey, and she mostly says fuck, and that's it. And honestly, that's kind of how I am when I don't want to be at work, so I get it. Rock on, girly. And then you have the visual gag that the magical companions just look like grown men in onesies with mascot heads on. They are eventually shown to be very pretty angel boys, but whenever they're on Earth, they're in animal head mode, which inevitably ends up coming off as creepy and weird, which is the joke with the two of them. Tied with the way that Byakuya's is definitely no altruist and is actively making her life worse outside of the magical girl stuff, and you've got a messy twist on the typical mascot fairy. I feel like there's some places where you could have some jokes with Shun's coworkers, but unfortunately there's a lack of screen time to the point that we don't get enough of them to really figure them out. There are bits and pieces here and there, but aside from the really stupid one he brings along to meet Byakuya at one point, leading to keeping up the ruse that this is for information gathering the whole time, none of them really add much interest to the show. Overall, it's some really cute fluff that I would recommend to those who like soft, fluffy romances. There's nothing terribly deep here, but it's not trying to be some deep exploration of the human soul. It's just a truly sweet slice of cake to make your heart happy for a little while in this mess of a world. That said, though, there are a few problems I have with the series, even if I do think it's worth watching. It's mostly little things, but they're worth bringing up both in the interest of fairness and giving you guys a bit of a heads up for what you can expect going in. Firstly, there are spots where the depiction of Byakuya can get a touch fan servicey. This certainly isn't a constant problem like another series we just finished talking about, but it does come up. So if that is something that turns you off from a series from the word go, then I would advise you to proceed with caution. But it is there, which is a bit of a shame in something that has an otherwise soft and romantic tone. It's worth keeping in mind that this was published in a shonen publication. There's also the age thing. So it is really unclear what age Byakuya is meant to be. She definitely looks young, but at a glance between her design and the art style, I could see rating her as being anywhere from a teenager to her early 20s, but just depicted as visually petite and fragile. The show never outright confirms her age, and what signals we do get for how old she is are messy and confusing. On one hand, you have Hibana confirmed to be 15. Byakuya states at one point that she and Hibana were in the same class in school as children. This would make it seem that they are both the same age. However, on the other hand, you have Byakuya working multiple jobs, including overnight shifts at a convenience store and construction, both of which seem they would be unlikely to or legally unable to hire a 15-year-old for. Byakuya also was at an orphanage, so could it be that they were in the same orphanage class together? It's really unclear. And while that is messy, it wouldn't be that big of a problem if not for the fact that Shun is very much depicted as though he is a grown man in his 20s. So this is something that is possibly an age gap that includes a minor, but it is somewhat unclear, and I can definitely see some people having a problem with that ambiguity. It's something that's going to be up to the individual viewers. It didn't bother me as much as I was mostly able to put the question out of mind, but the mention with Hibana did really blindside me when it first came up. I'm personally not willing to put a definitive number down for her at this time, and I mostly just put it out of mind. Like, you just sometimes have to do about a detail like that when it's not consistent enough to make sense, and one answer would really bother you. And there was one more element with the romance that could be a bit of a make or break factor for some people. The magical girl and the evil lieutenant used to be archenemies falls under the category of being a rescue romance. This means that part of the romantic relationship is derived from either a literal rescue happening or a desire to rescue someone from something. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. A trope is a neutral entity, after all. However, this is something that's going to be hit or miss for people depending on their romance preferences, especially since this show tends to fall into the latter category that I mentioned. There is a decent amount of content that is Shun wanting to rescue Byakuya from the situation of not only basically being forced into being a magical girl, but also the way that the mascot is taking advantage of her by having her work multiple jobs and then hand all the money over to him to manage. Now, that is a horrific situation played mostly for comedy in the show, and nothing truly horrible ever actually happens, but she is characterized as being both poor and overworked as a result of this. The end point of the setup is that Shun never actually does anything to remedy the situation, nor does Byakuya accept any extensive help, since either of those would ruin the status quo of the show. He does buy her treats frequently and confront the mascot about his behavior a few times, but that's about the extent of it, aside from him thinking about how strong she is for putting up with that, or wishing that he could make her circumstances better. And yes, she is characterized as having a strong center to be putting up with all this, but it is really going to depend on you as a viewer if you end up getting that sort of man coming in to fix everything about a sad girl's life vibe from it. For me, that only happened once or twice, and I never felt like it was lingering in it too much, but it is something that might stick in the craw of other people. Byakuya is a mostly reactionary character for most of the season, which might also rub people the wrong way, but once again, it's a personal preference thing. I guess it also depends on if the comedy works for you too, something else that's going to be highly subjective. I never got to the point of more than maybe a strong exhale out of the nose for this one personally, but you might end up loving it. At the end of the day, this ends up mostly falling into the realm of being a show that's mostly turn your brain off fluff, and sometimes we just need that. But it's also going to be one of those ones where you're either going to love it or hate it. This is also mostly about the relationship between the characters, which is cute, but keeps us from experiencing too much magical girl action. It definitely feels the romance niche without too much deeper to it and only half-length episodes, so it won't have that much staying power for me. Magilumiere Magical Girls Inc. is perhaps my new favorite magical girl premiere in the past year. If you are someone that's been craving adult magical girls living adult lives while also doing their magical girl thing, this is going to be one for you. The setting is a world where being a magical girl is a legitimate profession that is held in pretty high regard for a young woman to go into, with there being hundreds of magical girl companies, all with their own methods for getting the job done. Essentially, magical girls are high-stakes exterminators using a variety of different magical tools in order to handle supernatural monsters and keep them from getting out of hand in the process of wiping them out. That's something that's only getting harder as time goes on, since every time the technology to wipe monsters out gets more powerful, the monsters become more fortified. The series itself even aptly compares this to the way that pests will evolve in response to the pesticides used against them. This season follows the early days of the career of Kana, who got a little swept up in a magical girl job while she was trying to interview for her first job out of college. The magical girl on the job, Koshigaya, ends up taking a bit of a shine to Kana when she helps out, and knowing that her company is looking to hire another magical girl, puts in a good word, getting Kana hired at the titular Magilumiere. From there, we get to explore the world of magical girls and the various companies that hire and manage them through Kana's eyes, as she gets more involved in the job. There's a few different things about this that appeal to me. The show has some decent world building. It's focused on adult magical girls. It takes the angle of looking at what a corporatized magical girl world would look like, and I really ended up falling in love with the characters. So let's take a closer look at what some of this show is doing, starting with those characters. Kana might seem somewhat unassuming, especially compared to the brash, action-oriented Koshigaya, but she gets a chance to have her own strengths that shine. Initially, it's made clear that she has a knack for research, a very good memory, and an eye for detail, all of which make her a good asset out in the field. While there are points where she wonders if she's actually bringing anything to the table, later on in the season we get to see another one of her talents. Poring over the manuals that most overlook and remembering much of what she has read leaves her uniquely capable in using magic tools at her disposal to their fullest extent, meaning she can figure out how to utilize features in unique ways to solve unique problems. And this is a really cool way to display a magical girl because it does paint her as using cleverness and working out problems rather than just firing a bigger beam at the enemy to win. It allows her to have a fundamentally different approach than her peers, making her stand out. Outside that, though, she does really just feel like a normal person brought into the magical girl world, which, while that definitely works to allow her to play off her eccentric coworkers and other characters, also allows her to remain relatable even as she discovers her real capabilities. She's grounded and realistic in a magical world. And she's just plain cute, guys. Look at her. She's adorable. One of the other things that really stands out about Kana, though, is the way that she serves as a bridge towards other companies, acting as the eyes we see them through. Obviously, she slots well into this position as the main character, but she also does well with that because she serves as a character who is able to learn from other magical girls that she works with. Koshigaya theoretically could go and work on these cross-company projects, but she isn't designed in a way that she would soak up as much from them as Kana would. Koshigaya herself, though, is still just a lot of fun to watch go about things in this series. She's more experienced, which leads to an increased confidence and being far more comfortable with the day-to-day things. She's very much settled into her way of doing things and doesn't feel the need to follow policy to the letter, more going with what feels right. She's more instinct-based, which really places her as a perfect partner for Kana. She also fills something of a big sister role for her, even if she can't be that in all topics. It's clear there's a mutual respect there, though, and she even starts to defer to Kana once she gets her feet under her. Seeing Kana come into her own is great, but that wouldn't have happened without Koshigaya, and she's a generally enjoyable character to watch. Midori Kawa is the manager of the team and is mostly just there to serve the function as the reliable adult, the most normal one of all, who's able to predict the rest of the group well enough to keep things functioning. The series really hasn't had time to get into him yet, but it is implied he was the first hire at the company, so I'm hoping we can eventually get into that story, because while he might be on the more bland side compared to the rest of the group, I do think he has a lot of potential. Shigemoto is the character that I'm a little mixed on. On one hand, he's really fun and silly, his appreciation for the history of magical girls is clear and taken quite seriously. He's also definitely a man of principles, following what is right and getting the job done in the best way possible for the public rather than just chasing profits. He definitely has an implied history in the world too, which I hope the series will get into soon. In particular, there's a historical disaster that he has some connections with that I'm curious about. But on the other hand, his character does end up leaving me a little on edge throughout the series. Obviously, he wears a magical girl costume at nearly all times, for reasons that are never explained beyond he has his reasons. This is handled mostly well. It's not so much that his appearance is the joke, but the way people react to him upon first meeting him is. Him dressing this way is actually treated fairly neutrally throughout the series. However, I do constantly worry that it's going to be mishandled and painted in a poor light, which leaves me a little tense when he becomes the focus of a scene. I also suspect that it will be trauma reasons behind this, which is fine, but also a little disappointing in its own way since it's fairly predictable and takes away from him just dressing like that because he enjoys it being a solid indicator of personality. He definitely moves to the beat of his own drum, though, something that is good not only for the series, but seemingly is going to be good for the industry as a whole in this show. Nikoyama is the resident tech guy and ends up getting something of a mini arc for himself in the late portion of the season, which I did appreciate since it gave us more insight into his side of the job. He's your typical nerdy coder type of guy, but the show gives him some self-doubts and some pretty intense issues connecting with strangers. This ends up being his wall to overcome and needing to ask others for help during a crisis situation instead of just relying on himself and shutting others out. As someone who works in a corporate setting for her day job, having a look into the idea of a corporatized magical girl world was really fun, even more so with this being set in a world that also has magical girl media akin to our world, allowing magical girls to exist both as a job and a media to be fan of, leading to there being characters that are in the magical girl industry because they love magical girls. Characters will openly ask if XYZ thing that another character does or wears is a reference to some other thing. That's nice and gives a sense of a more full world that has a history. It also means that it's made clear that some things are more done for the sake of keeping up the expected image of a magical girl rather than them being strictly practical. For example, there are transformation sequences for the sake of girls changing into their costumes in this world, though it's really more akin to putting on a company uniform. We're specifically told that these are something that have to be programmed and set up, and it's shown that the visual effects of the transformation are something that is projected in the real world while clothes are changing. That's such a fun little touch. Like, part of the job is being a good role model to kids, being an authority figure to civilians, and embodying your specific company's image. So having a transformation sequence along with this method to quickly suit up into work clothes makes a little sense if we're willing to engage with those fantasy rules. I also love that each company clearly has a different sort of image for their magical girls. Some are more classic and frilly costumes, some are almost fashion models, and some are more sleek and business-like, each of these giving a little impression of the culture of these companies. For example, the titular Magilumiere has costumes that kind of straddle the line. They have some clear magical girl influence, but they're also clearly built for some level of practicality, avoiding having frills and bows that might get in the way of actually getting work done while also looking cute on the girls wearing them. One detail I personally found to be really interesting was the way that the spells of the lead characters were shown off. So, I made a note early on that Kana and Koshigai's spells that they used to subdue the monsters of the show didn't have any kind of cutesy names or anything. In fact, it sounded more like programs, which I just chalked up to the fact that we were being shown that spells were something programmed behind the scenes, a little touch to reinforce that. However, later on in the show, we start being shown other magical girl companies and how they work, giving us some contrast between the bigger companies and the little startup that our cast works at. And at those other companies, most of the spells have names to suit aesthetic. Come the end of the season, it becomes clear just how differently from everyone else our lead cast functions. We are often shown Nikoyama whipping up custom spells to suit the needs of the characters, which felt to me like a natural extension of the typically soft magic systems that some magical girl shows can run on. No, actually that is something that is considered very out of the norm in this world, with most magical girls just working off a set of prepackaged spell circles that are uploaded to their wands rather than getting real-time updates to adjust to the situation. The reason that none of their spells have names isn't to convey that these spells are partially code, but because these characters don't have time to come up with a cute name before they fire them. That's such a nice little touch that evolves as we learn how things function in this world that I really appreciated. I also love the way that we get used to the way things are done at Magilumiere and find out only after we're used to it how weird their company is in the landscape of the industry. Their way feels right since we see it in practice often and see the benefits of how they function. But as things unfold, we get to see the more standard way of handling these sorts of jobs, which in turn makes us realize the way that our characters are kind of groundbreaking. I don't think that the world building is completely fully fleshed out at this point. I do think there is more they need to get into, and I think there are some holes here, like how there doesn't seem to be any regulation or certification around magical girls using brooms to fly around. Like, I feel like there would be something similar to a driving or boating exam for that, but recognizing that this is based off of an ongoing manga, I am willing to let it stew a little longer in the interest of showing me at a more natural pace rather than trying to explain everything all at once. Already, I get to see what is basically an industry trade show episode, which is more than I can say about most workplace anime. I also just do love that all these magical girls are fully adult women who have adult priorities and perspectives. That's not something we often get in this genre, and I really love seeing that. I work in a corporate environment, perhaps not anything like the one shown in this show, but still corporate. I love that Kana gets her new job and is like, right, benefits package and salary, because while they do care about people, this is an actual job that they do for an actual living. Though, despite how much I love what I've been given so far and what I love about these characters, it's not by any means perfect. This is a series that still has some shallow aspects since it's only 12 episodes into the story. There are some characters that I feel like I've really gotten to know, but there are also plenty that I feel like I'm only seeing at a surface level or don't have as much depth as I feel the show wants me to feel like they have. And I'm going to be real with you, I'm going to need them to start getting into that Shigemoto backstory and what his beef with the head of the biggest company is, because I think I might actually lose it if this series tries to keep playing coy with that for too much longer. I do also think this is a series that needs to get a little more into the dangerous side of things than it already has. Sure, our characters have had some close calls where it seems like they could have actually gotten hurt, but it's nothing that's ever felt dangerous to them, if that makes sense. The danger isn't all that grounded. There's a point where a character pushes Kana out of danger and the episode ends with her getting hurt, but in the next, it's just a cut on her face which is bleeding. And sure, this is a little bit of a bigger deal because she works as a model as well, but it did end up feeling like the show was pulling its punches a little. Kana was somewhat careless and distracted in a moment where she shouldn't have been, and I feel like there should have been a little more consequence for that. I'm not saying this other character had to die, but the cut seems like it wasn't proportional to the way it was being portrayed. The series also varies a little in terms of animation for me. There are times where it does look downright beautiful, but there are others where it might not feel like it's doing anything all that special. And like, on one hand, that's good. It means the team behind this knows where they should be going all out and where they should be conserving their energy. But it also means that we've been hit a little bit with the old CGI monsters that don't entirely feel like they fit bug. Not the worst I've seen by any means, but it does mean the danger is sometimes undersold a little as a result. None of this is anything I see as a deterrent in any way, though, since it's one of those cases where I can tell that this is in a growth period for this series. But it's one of those ones, I wish we could have just gotten 2 cores back to back to give it some time to find its feet, even if the stopping point it found at the end of this 12 episodes was really nice. What this brings to the landscape is a magical girl series focused on adults that displays a love for the genre without overloading itself with references that are too on the nose. It brings a new perspective that we've been lacking and kind of carves out a new space for itself. It would be easy for me to say that Acro Trip is the clean version of the concept of gushing over magical girls. Once again, we have a girl who looks up to magical girls, ending up in a situation where, in order to make her favorite magical girl shine, she ends up having to take up the role of the villain. However, the execution is something that is so completely different, it leads to a completely different tone and direction, even if you were to remove the sexual elements from gushing before even starting to compare them. Instead of getting into the concept right away, it actually takes several episodes for Chizuko to start working as a villain, even though it was proposed to her in the first. Instead of a trio of magical girls, there is just one. Also, everyone on every side is kind of incompetent. The biggest thing that Acro Trip is as a series is a comedy. The goal is to do the ha-ha funnies, and that's the extent of it. There is a little bit of a through line of Chizuko finding a support system and sense of purpose she was lacking when she was moving around with her mom, but it's not something that the series is really forefronting since the goal here is really to try and make you laugh. And that's not a bad thing, to be clear, but if the comedy doesn't hit for you, then you're not going to have a terribly good time with the series. Personally, I enjoyed the early episodes a decent amount, but as time went on, I ended up growing pretty tired of the series. So the story here is that we have Chizuko, a teenage girl who's kind of drifting until she sees a magical girl fight go down one day while visiting her grandfather. This astounds her as it's something completely different to what she's seen everywhere else she's lived. She chooses to continue living with her grandfather so she can keep seeing this and becomes an outright fangirl of Berry Blossom, the magical girl, despite how everyone else in town, this has basically become a banal part of their everyday lives. One day, she ends up having an encounter with Chrome, the villain mastermind that Berry Blossom is always fighting. You see, he overheard Chizuko talking to herself about the ways he could have improved his attack. He decides that Chizuko should definitely be working with him, which she will, but it'll take a few episodes of waffling about before we actually get there and start doing that. From there, it's just comedy all the way down as it becomes clear that everyone in this whole scenario is kind of an idiot. Chizuko is so obsessed with her idol that she can't properly do villain stuff because she's swept up in how amazing she finds her. Chrome is a moron who doesn't know what he's doing half the time, and the other half has villainy that consists mostly of causing the most minor of inconveniences that don't actually matter. Berry Blossom, real name Kaju, takes her job very seriously, but is mostly floundering her way through it, though that hardly matters because her opponent is Chrome, who is pretty easy to outwit. Outside of those three, you have Mashiro, Berry Blossom's animal sidekick, who is mostly spending his time filming her fights to promote her or bailing her out. He likely has the most solid head on his shoulders, but it doesn't take much to come out on top there. And you have Chizuko's grandfather, who has been letting Chrome live in his crawl space and is the most chill about every situation that happens in front of him, and is mostly just supporting everyone around him the best he can, including driving Chrome and Chizuko to their magic battles when their magic to teleport has run out. All of this is very firmly done with this sort of tongue-in-cheek attitude while gesturing towards the whole cast and going, "Look at these idiots." Don't get me wrong, that's a fun time, but it's also something that I ended up getting pretty bored with the longer it went on. Granted, I ended up binging the last several episodes all at once after falling behind, so that might have played a role in it. This is definitely a show you should only watch a little bit at a time rather than going on binges of. After it gets into the swing of things, the episodes tend to not be a single story per episode, but a series of little adventures that the characters are going on, either loosely strung together or not connected at all and just happening back to back. In my mind, it was like a series of bits and jokes rather than stories, if that makes sense. So it can already feel like a lot is happening in an episode when you might get more than one story, so putting more than one episode like that back to back can make it feel like it's dragging. There are some larger stories interspersed in there too, mostly ways to sort of connect the characters in a web or lay out background information. There's only one lengthier adventures of the characters that felt like was impactful to me, and even that mostly just ended with a gag. This is a show where I'm not really invested in anything, even though it has moments where the characters do have these sort of heart-to-hearts. I just think with how much is gags and how little consequence there usually is, it's hard to get me to feel for the characters in those moments, because I never know what's going to be undercut with a joke. And sure, that's not really what the series is going for at the end of the day, but it does leave me kind of distant from the series and not very enthused about it personally, because I'm someone that tends to connect with characters and story for my investment in a show. Even then, there are some fun and silly ideas here to make a decent joke now and then. I just didn't personally get a ton of amusement out of it because my humor in the shows weren't aligning all that much. But I would say there's at least one moment per episode where I wouldn't necessarily laugh, but the part of my brain recognizing a joke would light up for a second. Not necessarily like a huff of air out the nose, but more a quick internal, ha! And that's fine. It's something that sometimes happens with shows that are swinging for comedy. It won't land for everyone. However, I think part of the reason for this is because I was watching the show subtitled. That can sometimes throw off the comedic timing for jokes and make them less effective. As for where this stands in the landscape of the genre for the last year, I do think it actually occupies a fairly unique place. This is a series that is a meta-comedy about magical girls, poking fun at the genre while also doing its own thing, but it's aimed at the younger girls who would be the typical target audience for a magical girl show. That's not something you see very often. Usually, meta-comedies in this vein are aimed at an older adult audience who have more experience with the genre or have a nostalgia for it. It's nice that girls who are in their peak magical girl years can have something that pokes a little fun at it for them too. Also, since the manga is lacking a translation and fan translation efforts have only covered a few chapters, this anime is basically the only way you can experience this story at this point. So I wasn't initially going to include this show in the list of ones I was talking about, but when I expanded things out, I thought, why not? While this might not be a magical girl in the common modern sense of things, it is a show about magical girls, does borrow from a sort of sweet, soft magical girl aesthetic, has repeated stock footage at a few points, and does somewhat connect with the style of older magical girl shows that didn't have a transformation and were more about using magic to solve problems. It's just a shame that this one doesn't manage to stick the landing after starting out on a decently strong foot. Let's start with the thing this show absolutely nails, though, the beautiful art style that's chosen. The stories of girls who couldn't be magicians renders its magical world in a wash of pastel watercolors that give the show a captivating sense from the moment you start watching it. Everything feels like it was pulled from the pages of a children's storybook, from the soft painted backgrounds to the sometimes silly and a touch over the top character designs. The animation itself might not be the most consistent thing in the world, and it's not going to knock your socks off in that department most of the time, but it's still a fun show to watch, and there are a few points where I think you could get a nice desktop background or art piece from a screenshot of this. If you're someone who likes to spend your time just watching pretty and interesting animation styles, I think this is worth looking at for that alone, though you could also get by just seeking out some of the highlights. It's overall nice to look at, but the writing side is where this one struggles and kind of ends up losing me. The story starts out well enough with a little girl, our lead Kurumi, meeting a magician out in the woods near her home. This encounter leads to her being gifted a little notebook which encourages her to strive to be a magician in the future. She applies to a prestigious school and manages to do well enough to get in, just not well enough to get into the magic class that's considered the cream of the crop as the school. So she ends up in the lower standard class, where students are mostly there to get an education that will let them pursue their own individual goals. Some of them are literally just there for an education and don't care about magic. It's still considered an amazing chance to even be in the low-level class, which is why it throws them all when their teacher walks in and proclaims she's going to teach all of them magic anyway. Stories is a series that has a lot of big ideas, but I don't think it really follows through on enough of them to feel satisfying. It has a lot of points where it feels like it's laying a groundwork for something that it never ends up picking up again, leaving me wondering if the implications were meant to be there or were just a happy accident. It does feel like a show that's kind of tearing itself in two, as it can't decide if it wants to be a plot-driven show about the shifting politics on how magic should be performed and the underground effort to bring ancient magic back into the mainstream, or an episodic slice-of-life fantasy about a bunch of students all doing their best to achieve their dreams with a magical world as the backdrop. Because while there is a plot here, it's caught and mingled in with all this slice-of-life stuff that's going on. Most of this comes down to there being 7 magical phenomena around the school that get encountered over time in those slice-of-life episodes that later end up being more important than they let on at first. On one hand, that later reveal could work to give more importance to what at first felt like a small detail, leading to a sense of satisfaction in the viewer, but they already felt sort of tacked on in those slice-of-life episodes, so it doesn't end up feeling that way. It ends up more feeling that undue importance is being granted to these things, which likely has to do with how most of the plot stuff is being shoved into the last few episodes at such a breakneck pace that it feels like the show is kind of pulling solutions out of its ass. It's also a show that just has way too many characters. You see, this is one of those shows that it's decided every character in the lead's class should have some kind of quirk or gimmick, and it gets old pretty quick. It's only a 12-episode series, so there's not time to do everything with the main cast and the plot and make these characters more than just their gimmicks. I understand that the series wants to have all these kids following their unique dreams and all, but it just ends up bogging down scenes that they're in and leading to characters that show up for just a line or two and then vanish for episodes at a stretch. In the end, not even the designated best friend character for Kurumi ends up amounting to all that much, even if the series does try to give their friendship a sense of weight and purpose, which is a real shame. Even that teacher, who is an important character both to the lead's development and the core plot, ends up completely underbaked. She goes off to look into something after a few episodes and ends up being gone for multiple episodes that are implied to stretch over a span of multiple months. She's not there having any impact, and we don't see her much outside of a shot or two an episode where she's at a table in the library looking at books and saying something cryptic. This even ends up not making a ton of sense with her stated motivations at the end of the series. There's implied backstory for her, but it's left so vague that it can be hard to tell what it's even trying to tell us about her, aside from establishing connections to two characters who she ends up interacting with in the present anyway, which shows their connection just as well. There's two magic-obsessed students that aren't in the magic course, and thus they have their own club to study magic, since the magic study club won't let them in unless they're in the magic course. They're in this place where they mostly end up as just exposition machines while also being really annoying, making me groan every time they showed up. There's a pair of identical twins, one of which got into the magic program and one who's in the non-magic program to pursue fashion. There's some sense early on that the two are scheming at something and have their own motivations, and that all ends up completely falling to the wayside. The non-magic one reduced to his gimmick more and more as the show goes on, and the magic one made into just a supportive ally from the magic class when the rest are more likely to turn up their nose at the lower class. There's also Kurumi's shape-shifting older brother, who is shown to be observing her multiple times, and then nothing comes of that in the end. There's teasing and hints of more to come, but as far as I'm aware, this is based on just a single novel that does not currently have an ongoing series attached to it, so I'm left confused as to what the point of including him was. He never even interacts with his sister, despite the way that them being related was treated as some sort of a revelation. All in all, only two characters end up leaving much of an impact. The titular girls who couldn't become magicians, despite the way they both clearly wanted to, because neither of them got into the magic class and ended up in the lower one. Yuzu is the character that starts off as a snobby rich girl throwing snide remarks at the lead, but they, of course, eventually become friends. She even manages to pull off doing some magic before Kurumi does, making her seem accomplished, even though it was something that was clearly in the heat of the moment and done out of desperation. As the series goes on, you get to see how she actually has a really solid head on her shoulders, and I grew to like her. She especially got to thrive when her two besties weren't in every scene with her, and she was able to have more one-on-one interactions with Kurumi. I'm not gonna lie, I might have actually preferred her as a lead. There's a choice that happens at the very end of the story that doesn't make a lot of sense for her, given some of the personal growth she talked about not terribly long before, but I won't spoil it in case any of you decide you actually want to watch this series. Kurumi is our actual lead, and the longer the series goes on, the more frustrating she becomes. This might be one of the few stories I've seen where there is a setup to the world that we are shown that is primed for it to be a story about how there are systemic barriers keeping an underdog down, but then by the middle of the season, the only thing keeping her down is herself. Look, I get it. Kurumi is a character that had her confidence take a hit when she, despite her studying and stellar grades, didn't get into the higher magic program. That's compounded by her learning a different form of magic and not managing to pick up on it as quickly as she'd hoped. Yet, when we get, for a third time, a scene where she almost does magic and then doesn't pull it off despite being really close, it does sort of start to get old. It feels less like Kurumi is actually struggling and more like the writers have shaken their heads and flipped the magic power switch to no so that she fails because it's not time for her to have magic yet. This is exacerbated by the way that this is visually presented, with her going through a whole cute little stock footage scene as build-up, only for it to just not work for some reason that isn't understandable to the audience watching. There's no understanding why she failed, so it can look like she just kind of gave up partway through casting the magic, which just makes the viewer feel frustrated. Then she quits trying magic when it happens again, and the only person encouraging her is AWOL at the moment. And then she gets told she has a shot at getting into the magic program via a special test because she shows promise, and her first thought is, but I quit magic. She spends the latter half of the series kind of boomeranging back and forth on if she actually quits or not, which is mostly boring to watch and made me dislike her as a character because when she talks about quitting, it feels like she's doing it in that way where she's just not going to pursue it anymore. But in practice, she acts like it means she can never even consider an opportunity put before her again, leading to that but I quit magic moment that I mentioned. There's a lot of talk in the last few episodes about how there's something special about her because she grew up in some magic-soaked forest and has so much potential, and she needed to be taught ancient magic rather than modern magic so that she could save everyone. But in the end, we never see whatever is so special about her really come to anything, and it seems like she's going to be part of the regular class not learning magic because her teacher is leaving. So, like, what was the point of all of this? The stories feels like it was almost made up as it went along in some aspects and not smoothed out into a proper cohesive narrative that built towards anything, languishing in slice of life and rushing to put together what loose threads it had into a climax at the last minute. There are so many elements that feel like they were trying to build a world and story in the early portion of the series, and then those never came back or fell into place by the end, leaving it an unsatisfying mess. Oh, and the cherry on top is that the villain's motivation contradicted itself and made no sense, and then he's caught and the danger is resolved, and he doesn't face any consequences for anything that he did, despite the fact that he could have gotten everyone killed. It just gets swept under the rug and we don't talk about it anymore. This show is messy with a capital M. The only thing about it that is going to stand out to me in my memory long term is the art that it had going for it. I guess we can say it brought aesthetics to the table. So one thing that really stood out to me about the Magical Girl shows that came out last year that we discussed today, only one of them is explicitly for adult audiences. Sure, you can argue that adults are going to relate more to Magilumiere or that adults might better understand the jokes in some of the others, but that doesn't mean that those series can't be watched and enjoyed by younger audiences. And this is great. This is a solid fistful of series to all get in one year and have them all have their own appeals, even if I won't personally be adding all of them to my favorites list. There was, for a time, an era where it could feel like so many of the Magical Girl series that were coming out were falling into the trend of the Tragical Girl, aimed at adults or people who couldn't handle Magical Girl content if it wasn't cut with some level of edginess. By no means were those the only Magical Girl shows coming out, but we can't deny that it was a bit of a trend for a while there. Seeing this swing of the pendulum back into giving us Magical Girl content that is more in the realm of being aimed at girls and young women makes me really happy. I like seeing things that feel like they were made for me or who I was when I was younger. For example, I recently started playing Infinity Nikki, an open world game that's also a dress-up game. And while I do find some parts of it a little cheesy, it is something that I've really come to enjoy. I feel like it was made for me. Yes, I want to explore that open world, but I want to do it in the biggest ball gown possible. And when I use the power to float and glide, I want to have goddamn fairy wings. I am a big gamer that does play several of the big titles that drop every year, but it's nice to know a game is aimed at my demographic and specific sometimes, you know? So I'm glad that the tide seems to be shifting a little, which is why I want to look forward to the future and what major Magical Girl anime projects have been announced to be coming down the pipeline. Keep in mind that we don't have a confirmed date on many of these, so it might be a little while before we get to see them. First, let's talk a little about the world of Precure. By the time I get this video out, Mirai Days, the follow-up to Mahosukai Precure, will be airing already. This follows the more grown-up adventures of the cast from that season and what I assume will be a similar endeavor as the Otona Precure series did for the Yes 5 girls. While I am curious, it will be a long time before I actually watch this since I am making my way through Precure in order and I haven't seen the original yet. I will admit that I personally don't have very high hopes though, as I'm of the opinion that Precure has never managed to fully pull off a sequel season in a satisfying manner. However, I will reserve my judgment until I actually get around to watching it, and I am definitely open to being pleasantly surprised. Then hopefully I will get this video out before the new yearly season of Precure starts. That would be Kimi to Idol Pretty Cure, cutely translated over here as You and Idol Precure. That translation to blend you and I with idol is actually really adorable, and I have to give a round of applause to whoever came up with that. However, from where I am now, I have to say I don't have a very favorable first impression of this season. Granted, it's going to be a long time before I get to this one, but it is something I am on the fence about in many regards, unfortunately. By time of writing, I have seen the designs of characters in official material, not just leaks, and I don't really care for them personally. I think the costume design is absolutely adorable, don't get me wrong. My gripe is more with the body proportions and the faces. Maybe there's something that'll look better in motion, which I have found can happen with Precure designs. But from what I have seen, I'm not a fan. The limbs seem especially spindly this time around in a way that puts them looking almost a little alien to me. Granted, that could just be the images I've seen haven't had them posed very dynamically, but my knee-jerk reaction isn't favorable. I also really just don't like the faces. They're bug-eyed in a way that passes the point of being cute and into the realm of looking weird for me. Once again, this could be a better in motion thing. I can see that the designs are meant to have a somewhat stylized look, but this form of stylization just isn't working for me personally at the moment. Good thing it's going to be a while before I get around to watching it. I am also incredibly wary of the theme. I will fully admit I'm not someone who really gets the whole idol thing. It doesn't help that I've never been into J-pop or K-pop. The closest I get is listening to anime theme songs now and then and thinking that one baby metal song from years ago still kind of slaps. I kind of see the appeal with the cute costumes and the choreography and all that, but it's never appealed to me. I think part of it is the artificiality of things and knowing the way these groups are typically assembled and meticulously marketed. I was never into boy bands or girl groups growing up either. And while there is plenty of fun to be had with idol groups, I am also aware of the dark sides that the industry has. Now, to be fair, most entertainment industries have their closets full of skeletons. This is not unique to idol culture by any means. But that doesn't mean we should just ignore the problems that the idol industry has. Something I am inclined to think this show will do because it's meant for very young girls. I don't think showing the glitz and glamour of something like this and covering up the bad stuff is something a show can do without criticism. In particular, the purity culture that surrounds idols worries me a lot, and I do fear this will get mingled with the whole good-hearted heroines bit that magical girls sometimes have. Please understand, I am not saying that you're a bad person if you wanted an idol-themed season of Precure. I am aware that even though there are other magical girl franchises that are somewhat idol-centric already, there are still many that wanted to see a Precure take on the concept, and I cannot blame you for that. I just personally can't get as excited as some others and do have my concerns about how this is going to present an industry that has historically had issues with exploitation to young girls. I had similar concerns with how Miki's modeling was handled in Fresh Precure. While I understand that this is added to the series basically as a form of play, I do also have concerns about how these industries are being presented to young girls with a completely rosy view of things. I don't expect Precure to engage with subjects like stalkers and whatnot. That's not generally their jam. But I would like if the show would touch on some of the hardships that sort of work has in a way that's more than just dealing with things with hard work and gumption. There are ways that this can be done in an age-appropriate manner. Fresh was able to tackle the way that girls were overworking themselves with both their Precure work and their dancing, even if I wasn't perfectly satisfied with the resolution there. Having both fighting and performing, as it seems we're going to get, be something that tires them out could be an important aspect. I just need there to be some drawbacks here. I don't want to see it be all rainbow and glitters about this. It's Korean, but I'll mention it because I've covered some of the seasons on this channel, but Teeny Ping is currently going strong with another season currently airing. I'm not going to be covering it yet, though. I've determined I need at least 1 year break between Teeny Ping seasons, so I'll cover season 3 next October and we'll see how things go from there. And for those who are Teeny Ping fans, the creators of that show are currently dropping another show called Wish Cat. It doesn't look like anything particularly interesting to me, but it's likely the same flavor as Teeny Ping if you're into that stuff. As for shows coming later down the line, Princession Orchestra is a music-themed magical girl show that we've only gotten some glimpses of, but I do think looks rather promising. It's coming from the studio Silverlink, though, who I have always found to be rather hit or miss. Granted, they do a lot of adaptational work, which does function a little differently than an original production like this. Given that this is their first original since 2018, I expect they're going to be putting their all into it to make it a nice big success for them. This is one where I'm hopeful, but cautiously so. Studio Pierrot is going to be giving us a Magical Girl series, and up until now, that's about all they've said. They had quite the run of these things back in the day and have done some adaptations since, but this is the first one that's really their own since Fancy Lala, so it's a pretty big deal. If you go back to those series, they might not look like the type of magical girl series that you're used to these days, but they were foundational to the growth of the genre, so they're definitely worth watching a few episodes of if you want to understand the roots of a magical girl. It will be interesting to me to see how much DNA of their magical girls in the past they use and how much they pull from modern trends and conceptions. No matter what direction they go in, it's bound to be at least interesting. And then there are a lot of sequels and expansions to franchises that have been confirmed to be upcoming. Gushing Over Magical Girls is confirmed to be getting a second season, which doesn't surprise me. While it might not have been a mainstream hit, the people who liked it really liked it and are likely willing to shell out for merch and DVDs and all that jazz. So if it makes money, it's gonna get another ride on the merry-go-round. I will say that there are some potentially interesting things coming with the content that's coming up in the manga, but the core things that most people take issue with are something that isn't going away anytime soon. So if you couldn't bear the first season, you're not going to have a fun time with the second one either. Personally, I'm giving it a pass. Magilumiere is set to get a second season as well, and I'm looking forward to that so much. It feels like a show that was almost made for me, so I'm going to keep watching as long as they keep making more, unless it were to completely change direction or tank or something like that. In the waiting period, I'm definitely going to be reading some of the manga, partially because I want to spend more time in this world, and partially because, damn, look at Kushigaya in this cover art. Are you kidding me? I need to know what's up with this. The lyrical Nanoha franchise is getting another series. This isn't something that I've gotten into since it's very multimedia and I was never sure exactly where to start. Maybe I'll give it a look before the new stuff, but it's a lot to get into, so this is likely one that's for people already entrenched in the Nanoha ecosystem. I'm not super familiar with Magical Girl Raising Project. It came out at a period of time where I wasn't watching as much anime, and from what I can tell, it's one of those magical girls go through horrific things series that took off in the wake of Madoka. I can't claim it entirely spawned from Madoka. That series came out in 2011, and the Raising Project's first novel dropped in 2012, which is a bit too fast of a turnaround to say Madoka inspired it, but I'm fairly certain it got something of a boost from people looking for Madoka-like series. It's my understanding that this is a death game sort of thing, and I do like a good death game, but the new season will be a new death game since it's taken from one of the follow-up novels. I don't have any in-depth knowledge about this one though, so I'll withhold my judgment. The Madoka franchise is finally getting the Walpurgis Nocta Rising movie we've been waiting a while for. It's being touted as one of those things that's both a finale to this saga and the birth of another, so I'm not exactly sure what to expect. Personally, I love the ending of the original series, bittersweet though it may be. While the movies have kept my interest, I am always constantly worried that they're going to kind of ruin the ending for me. And if this movie wraps things up, I don't think I want them to kick off a new saga on the back of this. I already avoided the anime based on that mobile game since it felt like it was milking things. Sometimes it's just good to let a story end, you know? Cardcaptor Sakura Clear Cards anime is coming back now that the manga has ended just about a year ago, which is really exciting. I do love the original series, warts and all, personally. If you're like me and have never gotten around to Clear Card, I think now is the perfect time to do so. So looking forward, it's a decent mix of both things that are aimed at the typical magical girl audience and things that are capturing that edgy adult demographic. I guess not every year can be like last year. It's still early days though, so it's entirely possible something might come out of the gate and surprise us as well. I'm looking forward to it, and a less packed year means I have time to get into other things as well. In fact, there are a lot of anime that I watch outside of magical girl stuff, so I'll give you a rapid fire round of recommendations of shows that aired last year. This is not everything I watched, but I really liked all of these. Please make sure to do your own research before watching them though, because I'm not going to be giving any further explanations or warnings for any of them. So we have Delicious in Dungeon, A Sign of Affection, Cherry Magic, 30 Years of Virginity Can Make You a Wizard, Apothecary Diaries, Free Ren Beyond Journey's End, Spice and Wolf, Merchant Meets the Wise Wolf, Senpai is an Otonoko, Twilight Out of Focus, Dan Da Dan, and the Ranma 1/2 remake. If you've stuck around this long, great job! You put up with me being possessed by the spirit to yap. Would you believe this was supposed to be a quick 15 to 30 minute video? Yeah, I'm not good at predicting how long these are going to be, honestly. And that's why they take me so long to make. So if you'd like to support me, a like, a follow, a comment, all of them, I really appreciate it. Anything to make the algorithm happy. But also, I do love discussing with you guys in the comments. As a reminder, I am going to be monitoring them a little more closely than usual this time, just because of certain topics in this video, but, you know, if you want to support me more directly, I do have a Patreon. Don't feel obligated, obviously, but these videos do take a lot of time and effort, so. I've been Mel, and thank you for letting me info dump at you.